This series of videos is going to discuss how to get started with the Django framework, Django Python web framework, using Visual Studio Code and Microsoft Azure. And I have Visual Studio Code opened up here, and I've got some extensions installed. So, for example, I've got, let's see here, clean things up just a little bit. So for example, I've got various Azure tools installed, Docker, make use of that later on for databases and deployment. PostgreSQL will come in handy. This one right here, the Python extension, come in very handy. SQLite, and I think that's all that I'll probably be using in here. Also notice I'm using WSL, the Windows Subsystem for Linux. So when I pull open my terminal here, you're going to notice I'm running bash. And in fact, you can even run Linux commands. So if I run this command, you'll see that I'm actually running Ubuntu 22.04. Now, so the commands that I'm running, even though it looks like the operating system I'm using is Windows, the commands that I'm using will be Linux-based. All right, with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started with the project. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a virtual environment. Now I already set up Python 3.11 on this machine. That's the most recent version of Python. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new directory for this project. We're going to create a record store. And I'll cd into that project. I'm going to create a virtual environment. There. Now I'm going to open that folder inside of Visual Studio Code. And yeah, I trust everything. And if I now hit Control-Shift-P, it'll bring up this command palette, and it'll have all the commands for the various extensions that are installed. And what I want to look for is Python Select Interpreter. Now, if you do this when you have a folder that's open that contains a virtual environment, most likely Visual Studio Code will detect that virtual environment and highlight it for you. Now, when I open up a new terminal, notice that it activates the virtual environment for me. So now I can, instead of saying Python 3.11, I can just use I can just invoke Python instead, and I'll get that version that was created with the virtual environment. After this, pretty easy to go ahead and install Django. Notice that if I do a pip freeze, only the packages that are installed inside of this virtual environment will be shown in the list. With that, I can go ahead and create a new Django project, or start a new Django project. And I'll call this record store. Now this is going to create a new folder called record store, and inside of it, another folder called record store. These are going to be all the files for our project, and we'll see how to use these, some of these throughout the rest of the series. But for right now, I wanted to talk about this manage.py file. And there are many different commands that you can run with this manage.py file in order to help you as you develop a Django application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cd into this record store directory. I'm going to say Python manage.py run server. This is going to start a development server, and actually I know exactly what's causing that problem. Let's run it again. There we go. You're going to see an error here about unapplied migrations. We'll get to that later in the series. But right now, notice that it started the development server on the local host address on port 8000. So if I go to a browser and I copy and paste that address, I'm going to see this page. And this is the default page. If you're seeing this, like it says, everything's working fine, and you have Django up and running. So in the next video, we'll take a look at how you can show your own content instead of the default content.